Welcome everybody to Tradewind's conference series, the first episode in the conference series. Thanks so much for joining us today. We have many esteemed guests today. First off, I'm going to get straight into it. This conference series, we're going to kick off with the situation with new graduates, teachers who are training at the moment at university, teachers who are looking to enter their first year of teaching, what that means for schools, what that means for the universities, what that means also for the VIT. Billy, what do you think are the main concerns for teachers who are graduating for the first time, who are going into the workforce for the first time as a teacher? And first off, please, Billy, do tell us who you are.
Yes, well, my background is obviously in teaching. I was a co-principal and assistant principal out in the West for, I taught in the West for all my career, Western Metro. And since 2014, I've worked as a principal consultant with Tradewind. So I do a lot of work, a lot of the PD work with my colleague, Terry Toomey. Terry couldn't be with us today. Terry's a former secondary principal from out in the Northeast of Northeast Metro, and Terry and I do a lot of the PD, a lot of mentoring for relief teachers. So we get across all the areas of Melbourne and get to meet a lot of people and have a bit to do with schools. So I guess we've got a bit of an idea, and we do deal with a lot of graduates, a lot of people who don't pick up roles initially at the start of the year, and then they work through Tradewind until they quite often pick up roles through the year. So I guess we're quite interested in what it's going to be like for those graduates. Typically, graduates will come out of university quite competent and confident, and usually they've come out of quite long stints, relatively long stints in class, in schools before they start their first year. I was just wondering, and we might get a perspective from all of our panelists on how disruptive it has been this year in terms of graduates, and we're looking at people who are going to move into the workforce, into the teaching profession in 2021. So has it been disruptive, and what can schools expect from their graduates?
Yeah, Billy, I think Janine, you're based in Federation University. Tell us what that experience has been this year in Ballarat.
So I'm Janine Burke. I'm the Deputy Dean of Education at Federation University, Australia. Look, I think that the biggest disruption to students has been that many of them can't work. They can't go out too much. Some of them have their own children at home. So they've had to engage in online learning. But by the time they're in fourth year, they're actually more ready to learn successfully online, which has been a good thing. I think that a lot of them have had stress, financial stress in their lives, and the uncertainty of what's going on has probably been the hardest thing for us to manage in terms of making sure that they're really clear on what they can do, what the requirements are, and because things keep changing, the goalposts keep moving. So we've had to really be on top of that and to keep talking to them and explaining to them to get them through that in their final year of study.
Yeah, Janine, can I just jump in there with a question? I mean, as I mentioned, graduates typically come out quite confident and competent. It's usually after the first term that they have to rethink all of that confidence and competence. But not really. But I'm just wondering, one of the real challenges for schools that we heard about and teachers that we heard about right at the start of the year was a lot of people who had been in schools for a very long time and had never had to move or migrate to a online teaching platform, I suppose. Is perhaps one of the advantages of this year for graduates coming into schools that they are going to be well across managing online learning, if we ever do have to use that again, and that there's a certain increase in their flexibility about the way that they would go about teaching kids?
Yep. Well, we're actually hearing that back from the schools because a lot of our students have been able to remain teaching their classes. Our students, our fourth years actually do an immersion prac, our undergraduates. So they would have already started in the schools before COVID hit. So they've built up the relationship and the rapport in the schools. And then they were to start their block days around about the time, or around about mid-year. So because they already had the relationship, the schools were pretty happy for them to remain. So they did a lot of online teaching, or they went into the school, the kids that were coming in daily, and worked with those children. So we haven't had a lot of impact from people needing to actually reduce the number of days to complete their degrees. most of them have been able to see all the days through. But the thing is, a lot of our online teaching has been what we call remote synchronous learning, which is not strictly online learning. In the online learning self-paced, you do it when you want to, but remote synchronous, you come in like we are now,
Yes.
and the teacher talks to you. And I think that's been successful because it's like being in the classroom, except, you know, it's all, you can answer questions and talk to people rather than read and engage with materials. And so I think in terms of being good online learners and also being able to teach remotely, this year's been great for students. And the schools have said to us that the students that have been working with them in remote or online teaching in their classrooms have been fantastic, and they've really valued their participation. So we're really pleased to hear that.
Yeah, that's great.
That is very against the trend for 2020. Saying things are great and going fantastically well. We're not on theme.
Well, the students were actually able, the pre-service teachers were actually able to make themselves useful and valued in the classrooms that they were working in. I think that's the point.
Yeah, absolutely. And Joanna, you're based in Latrobe in Melbourne's north, and also on the VIT Council. Would you reflect that sentiment from Janine, that there's been a lot of advantages to this year that have been forced? And what would be your concerns about, you know, what's happened and going forward for next year?
Sure. Thank you, Ian. So I'm Professor Joanna Barbusis. I'm the Dean of Education at Latrobe. I'm also the President of the Victorian Council of Deans. So taking Janine's point, I think there have been a lot of positives, but there've also been incredible challenges as well. And, you know, coming from the Dean at Latrobe, I think initially there was a lot of concerns from our pre-service teachers just around, I mean, particularly as we went into the first phase of lockdown, the uncertainty about what does this mean for me, the progression piece. So there was a lot of kind of communication padding that had to happen, and I'm sure Janine and others noted that really big piece of work to keep the pre-service teachers at bay and comfortable that we had their back and moving into this space. I think from a Victorian perspective, as Council of Deans and working with my colleagues really closely, you know, we moved to weekly meetings to make sure that we're dealing with the issues not only as providers of universities, but for the sector, and working really closely with VIT. And we set up a kind of a task force to make sure that the issues were being addressed. I think the big learning, how many times have we heard that since COVID? The big learning was really, initially there was a kind of a closing of the doors for pre-service teachers from schools. And this is across, but particularly in Metro Melbourne, not a priority. You know, we're going into lockdown, we just have to think about our students in our school, which has really actually provided both a kind of complexity for us as IT providers. How is this not a priority in terms of workforce, in terms of pipeline, but also knowing that the extraordinary pressures that schools were being, you know, put under during, you know, stage 3, then stage 4, and then, being more strategic about looking at the issues for both pre-service teachers, for schools, for systems, and how we as providers can work really collaboratively to address the issues. But you know, going with some of the points that Janine has made, I think it, you know, from the complexities and the constraints came some really interesting things. So, for example, at Latrobe, seeing pre-service teachers engaging and designing online learning with supervising teachers and students and parents for the first time was probably a real aha moment. You know, usually, you know, in the kind of normal context, and, you know, the pandemic context has provided, you know, other things. The normal context, really, the only real time pre-service teachers would engage with parents was, you know, interviews with, you know, student-teacher interviews. And the pre-service teacher would sit on the side and kind of take an observatory type role, maybe some comments. For the first time, there was this real engagement with parents, students, supervising teachers, pre-service teachers, designing learning. And I think those kinds of initiatives and kind of accidental pieces that have come out is what we need to notice to then not lose them as we move forward. I think you're on mute, Ian.
You're muted again.
Thank you so much. That's very good when the host mutes themselves. I should also say my name's Ian McNally. I work at Tradewind as the Learning and Development Specialist. But enough about me, not on mute. That's why I mute myself. Fiona, can we talk a little bit about those pre-service teachers? There'll be a lot of people tuning in today. And please, if you are attending today, please do ask in the Q&A section, or do comments in the chat about what's happening in this webinar. But Fiona, a lot of people will be thinking, if those pre-service teachers in their final year haven't had face-to-face classroom placements, surely they can't be signed off by the VIT, you know, to be ready to teach in a classroom in 2021. Can you tell us if that's correct, wrong, if there's complexities and considerations there?
Okay, no worries. Hi, everybody. My name's Fiona James. I'm the Director of Accreditation and Professional Practice at the Victorian Institute of Teaching. And I won't be so bold as to say, no, that's completely incorrect, Ian. But what we have tried to do in this space, as what I often term as your friendly regulator, is have a risk-based and standards-based approach to this. So everything we do is about that quality assurance piece and risk mitigation. So anything we did in this space and are continuing to do as a regulator, both to support a graduating cohort, but also to ensure quality, has been done from that lens. So that idea of, well, what are the risks? What are the things we need to quality assure? And what is the standards? What are the standards that these pre-service teachers need to meet? So basically, we need to also remember that COVID, although it has felt like an eternity, has been live in our lives since about March this year. Therefore, you've got a group of pre-service teachers that have been studying for a period of time and have had placements or observations and all of those sorts of things, and been working really hard during a really bizarre period of time. What we've tried to do through our regulatory approach and the regulatory measures is ensure that the key elements, I guess, of the standards are still met and adhered to. So all graduates would have still completed the land type requirement. So that's a literacy and numeracy test for initial teacher education. They would have still completed a teacher performance assessment, which is essentially like a capstone, so the end final performance. And what we did as a regulator in that particular space was note that that final assessment piece of teaching practice could actually be remote. Normally it is face-to-face. So it's that idea of you can do a blended remote or flexible learning placement. The other thing we've also supported and noted as the regulator, working very closely with the BCDE and the Department of Education from a policy position, is the impact of COVID-19 on particular learning cohorts within schools and early childhood services. So either those at risk or those potentially from low socioeconomic backgrounds, etc., and access to online technologies and platforms and or other concerns that I think people have talked about already. So what we have supported is a small group tutoring initiative. So some of our pre-service teachers will be working with smaller groups who are identified by schools to have potentially fallen behind in particular areas. So it might be literacy and numeracy, but it also might be other areas that they require support in. And the pre-service teachers will work closely with the classroom teacher to ensure that there's really specialised small group learning initiatives that are developed and supported through that. So what we're looking at is, I guess, a more diverse approach to what practice looks like in 2020 and potentially in 2021. We don't know what our future state will be, at least the immediate future state, and if potentially there will be further school closures depending on context and pandemic, and or on what stage of lockdown, whether we're 4, 3, 2 or 1. And noting that it can still move between those stages. So the other thing we've had to be quite cognizant of as a regulator is that flexibility in our own approach. So we've tried to be completely transparent as we've gone along. Everything we've done, we've taken through the Minister's office because it's part of that whole of government response to COVID-19. And we're quite fortunate that Minister Molino is actually the Minister for COVID-19 response for education and training. So that's helpful. And the other part of this is where we are actually in partnership, probably a true partnership with our ITE providers in this. So this is something where it's that kind of, on all the ad campaigns, we're all in this together. This is kind of that in real life. And what we've really had to do is say, well, what can we do as the regulator to A, support you to keep this quality focus, B, support you through working with the Department, Catholic Education and Independent Schools Victoria to get our pre-service teachers a placement, whatever that may look like. And if there's no new time for thinking now, like when will we do it? So that's what we've been really focusing on, is how we as the regulator can support quality placements, quality outcomes, and noting that at the end of this, every ITE provider still needs to attest to the fact that these pre-service teachers meet all of the APST at the graduate teacher level. Otherwise, they can't graduate. So there is still that mechanism of quality assurance at play.
Yeah, sorry, Fiona, could I just jump in there?
Oh, it's fine.
Question then for Janine and Joanna. Given what Fiona's outlined there in terms of the, I suppose, some of the changes they've been prepared to make, nonetheless, has that been difficult to communicate to your students, to your staff, and what changes, in a sense, have you had to make to the assessments of your students? Because normally if they would go out and have a 6-week placement, they would be observed, there would be teacher feedback, there'd be a whole range of structures that you already had in place. Now those structures would obviously be disrupted if they're learning in a different way or their placements in a different way. How's that been to communicate to your students or undergraduates, and how's that been in terms of your staff?
Janine, did you want to start?
Yeah, look, I'll go back to March, and I think that Fiona and Joanna have already alluded to this. There was a lot of uncertainty from our students and from our staff as we sort of tried to negotiate what this was going to look like for the rest of the year, and a lot of anxiety also from the students because they want to finish. And I think that the VCDE, Victorian Council of Deans, and the VIT did a fantastic job of brokering what that would look like going forward. So it was just a matter of us being really careful about the way we sent the messages through to the students and the schools, so that we were all on the same page together. And I think we did that really successfully. We did have some schools who cancelled placements, but generally they didn't. So in terms of the requirements that students are expected to do, they've still done what they would have done in a normal year. They've done their TPA, their Teacher Performance Assessment. They will have done any assessment tasks associated with, because they were not negotiable. They still have to do those. So we made sure that happened. They still got the report from the schools in the same way that they have previously in regard to whatever form of learning that they were doing. So they're still meeting the standards as required. So I think that we can be, I think actually the fact that they've been able to shine through in this really difficult time is a really good testament to the students. And I think that people out there who are listening in schools can be well assured that these are resilient students who are able to negotiate and do whatever needs to be done with kids and in classrooms. And that's what this has really shown. I don't know, Joanna might want to add to that. I might have skipped over some of the parts of that question.
No, that's great, Janine. Just to add to what Janine was saying, I think one of the strengths of the approaches we took, which was to take a systemic approach rather than universities working individually to deal with the issues, I think that has allowed for kind of more grounded approaches to solutions. So for example, when we moved into the remote learning space, we actually had a little working group from the task force, which was Deans, VIT and the department, to put together a one-pager linking remote learning practices and processes to the standards, to the teacher standards, so that there was an understanding for schools, so to minimise the confusion for them. Because one of the big things as we moved into this space is how do we make sure that our pre-service teachers are not cluttered with a whole range of information, our schools are not overwhelmed with, you know, a zillion universities going to them and saying, we're doing this and we're doing this, and to really position an approach that was specific to the context, and the context of the classroom, of the learning environment was changing. We wanted to make sure that that communication to students, to schools, to providers were consistent. And I think we did that quite well from the beginning and moving forward. But I agree with Janine. I think, you know, this is not a deficit population coming into the teaching profession. These are groups of people who are really going to, you know, do some significant, fabulous things because they were challenged at a time to be resourceful, to be resilient, all those things we talk about that we need and want in teachers and our students. Talking to one of our graduates who said that her supervising teacher and the principal of the school advised her to position her application for a teaching, you know, position as this is a really unique opportunity, and spin it as a positive, because no other teacher has been able to work and position their practice in this particular context. So it's not a deficit cohort. This is a cohort to really be celebrated in this outrageous time that we're living in.
Yeah, that's.
And Linda, welcome. I don't think you've said anything yet, Linda. We've got so many wonderful guests. Linda, I'd like to ask just around the attrition rates in terms of you know, pre-service teachers that come into the profession. Then you have to do your provisional registration task. How is that going to be more challenging or less challenging, or how the VIT kind of moving to and pivoting to ensure that these pre-service teachers are not going to be lost to the profession within the first couple of years because of that, you know, extra weight of admin and so on?
I think that just to reiterate what both Janine and Joanna are saying, we're in the process now of doing a lot of presentations for ITE providers, people gearing up for their initial registration with VIT. And the atmosphere is not one of panic at all. In fact, it's incredibly calm. And while people might think that this cohort might be feeling a little bit underdone, that's certainly not the case, and that's certainly not the impression that we're getting. They're very well informed. They've been fulfilling all of their requirements, and they are looking now and ready to move forward into the next phase of their professional career. And part of that is that discussion that we have about, well, once you graduate, then you come in on provisional registration, and there is a process to move your practice from the graduate level of the standard to the proficient level of the standards. And we have a number of supports that is just part of business as usual for VIT that we've been developing over a number of years. And we have very good relationships and partnerships across all of the sectors. So we work very closely with DET, with all of the Catholic dioceses in Victoria, independent schools Victoria. We make sure that we connect with school leadership and centre leadership to try to support the various levels of schools. So that's the leadership within the schools, so that they and centres, so that they understand what the requirements are. We train mentors to support new career teachers through those early stages. And we also supply direct support and resources for the provisionally registered teachers. So there's a lot of information on the website that's continually updated. We're continually developing new resources as we respond to feedback from various seminars. We have dedicated mailboxes for both mentors and for provisionally registered teachers, so that there's they can get their questions answered very directly and in a timely response from our professional practice team. Sorry, I didn't introduce myself at the beginning there, but my role is as manager of the professional practice team. And we're all teachers, and our job is to, a large part of our job is to support early career teachers through those early stages and phases. And we continue to see incredible commitment from the mentors. They see that as a critical role moving forward, and the provisionally registered teachers have a very strong commitment to developing their practice and see it as a very valuable, we know that through our data, very valuable process moving forward and actually making positive changes to their practice. So I think it's a good news story moving forward. Again, not very 2020-like, but...
Yeah, I don't like this. This is way too optimistic, this webinar. I'm used to the outlook being bleak, but you're really cheering me up, and I don't know what to do with it. We just had a question, Linda, just from Karanisa in the Q&A, just saying, that their school, they love having new grads, but some of them will have to wait till the registration's being approved before applying. Will COVID situation delay them getting their approval in time for 2021? A number of their staff apparently have had delays this year.
I'm not too sure about the delays, because when the process for initial registration probably started about a month ago, so it was open. And students can start that process, get all the documentation and things that they need, and then it's just a matter of waiting for the universities to deliver those results. So unless Fiona would like to correct me, I don't think that there is anything particularly different about this year in terms of moving forward, and that they can still apply for jobs going forward, as they always have done sort of at this time of year, around October, when a lot of staffing's actually happening. Those workforces will know that they're awaiting their VIT, and that's sort of part of the staffing landscape. But I will defer to Fiona just to check on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. And just building on what you're saying, Linda, the evidence of completion, which is basically the final set of results from ITE providers, gets admitted from each of our providers to VIT, and then that gets attached to each of the applications. But at any time, a pre-service teacher in their graduating year can basically have their entire application finished in their My VIT portal and ready to go, and all that then is waiting is for the evidence of completion. And then obviously there's the suitability checks for criminal history and things like that, but that then is the time that they're able to move to provisional registration. And we're also, depending on how term 4 goes with placements, we're actually able to take those evidence of completions from providers in batches. So for example, let's pretend that there's a few pre-service teachers that end up doing a placement quite late in term 4. There's the provider of that pre-service teacher is still able to submit their evidence of completion at any time to VIT, so from December to January, February, and we can still accept that and process those. So as Linda was saying, most graduate cohorts will start applying before they've got their registration card or whatever it might be, or they're on the register rather than have their card because they're still on the register without a card, and that's part of the process. So that should be fine. There might be a delay depending on when a placement takes place. We also potentially note that some may place early next year and then finish an acquired lot of days that may still be outstanding, and then still be able to be employed in time for the beginning of term 1 with their registration. So it'll be a bit elongated rather than delayed, I think is probably a good way to say it, depending on each circumstance.
Billy, you were a school principal.
Janine, I was going to ask the same question around knowing full well that schools do a lot of planning and advertising of graduate roles at this time. But Janine, were you going to say something about, is it likely that some of those results will be delayed?
Some of them will be if the students' placements have been postponed. So we won't be able to provide the evidence of completion, which is the key element that the VIT requires, until we get the reports in from the schools and we can process the results and we can finalise their academic transcripts. We always give that the highest priority to our fourth year students. But if, for instance, the report is held up in the school, our hands are tied a little bit, and that does slow the whole chain of things. So I'd say if there's anyone out there who's supervising a fourth year pre-service teacher, please get the reports back in a timely way, and that way we can keep things moving along. But the VIT are very good in the way that they will process in batches. So as soon as our transcripts have been, results have been ratified, we can send them forward in a batch on behalf of the students, and we keep doing that as they keep coming through.
Fiona, just looking at that from a school's point of view then, would you suggest, and everything today has been very reassuring on all levels. I certainly take the point that, students who go through these more challenging times are probably likely to come out better teachers anyway. But also I think what's been really reassuring has been the obvious coordination between all the universities through the deans, the meetings with VIT. A lot of schools would have no idea that those things were happening, and that's really great. But should schools still have the confidence to go ahead and make decisions on selection committees around, graduate teachers, even though some of these processes may be held up?
Yeah, I think it comes back to that idea of transparency. So there would be an obvious lack of a registration against that person's name, for example.
Yeah.
They would be able to provide evidence that they are in their final year, and I'm sure that they would interview quite well because they're quite used to virtual interviews and virtual spaces. So I would have confidence. I think the only thing that everyone needs to be mindful of in the background is VIT suitability threshold, so the suitability to teach and any criminal history and those sorts of things. That is a separate matter. But in relation to both their, I think it's been talked about, they're flexible, resilient, able to cope with change, quite resourceful, experienced in fluctuating online, remote, blended learning environments, all of those sorts of things, they'll be able to attest to their skill set quite nicely, I think. And also noting that where possible, both we as the regulator and all of our 12 ITE providers in Victoria have encouraged or tried their hardest to get the full complement of placement days where possible. So you'll find, for example, that regions who are in stage 3 may have more face-to-face contact than Metro Melbourne, but then you also might find that Metro Melbourne, for example, took up the small group tutoring initiative and have this wonderful ability to cater for diverse learning cohorts. So you're going to see different differences come through, and you're also going to have, I think, somebody who can give something slightly different to the staff context. And noting that they themselves as learners have had to switch to online as well. So normally they'd be in these face-to-face practicum-based pedagogical units, etc. But now they've really had to themselves learn through this, I think asynchronous and synchronous learning was mentioned earlier. Like they're fully across all of these types of technological platforms. And the other thing VIT has done in this time and will be doing for pre-service teachers and already does for registered teachers is that digital professionalism. So that's another element of all of this, that when you're a teacher in an online environment with apps and whatever else is happening depending on your school context, how you operate within that environment as a professional is quite different and unique. And there's both challenges and opportunities in those spaces as well. So you're going to have someone who's across all of those sorts of elements. So I would have every confidence with this graduating cohort. One of the things that we've always said in our task force meetings, which are weekly, because everything changes so quickly with this, is that this is not a cohort that we have an asterisk against at all. If anything, despite the challenges, they've all met the challenges. So that they've obviously expressed frustration and dismay, and like the rest of us, that kind of, oh, is this ever going to finish? But in response to that, instead of being defeated and attriting from programs, which was one of the initial concerns, is that we would lose some people within programs, they've stayed the course, they've sought the information they needed, they've got the clarifications from their providers and from us as the regulator, and they've kept at it. And so persistence is something that you sort of can't really buy. So yeah, I think there'll be a really interesting group of teachers, I think, in a couple of years' time.
That's
and
great.
Can I just ask Joanna, from your perspective, this is going to be an interesting and resilient group of teachers who are coming through, and perhaps not just this year, but maybe for the next 2 or 3 years, depending on how this plays out. What type of things do you think, on a school level, you would like to see schools doing to maybe adjust or cater for? What do you think that the new teachers coming through will need when they get on the ground in the schools?
Look, that's a very good question. I think it goes back to making sure that it isn't about what they need because they've missed out, but what they need in terms of this particular cohort experiencing, their development as a teacher at a time that has given them, new insights of learning contexts, and with that, it's an opportunity for, I think, leaders in schools, principals, school context, to work with these new teachers coming into the profession, and to look at what they can contribute to the changing context of education overall. We're never going back to anything. We're going to be living and working within a pandemic-affected world for some time, and it will challenge the existing norms, the order that we had, to not a disorder but a reimagined order. And I think the challenge will be at leadership level, not just principals but leaders in the school, to think about these new teachers coming into the profession and what that means for their new context of learning in a school. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but I think we need to be careful about what they need as mentoring. Mentoring is really important at every career stage, and this would be, very true for this cohort, but not in terms, I suppose for me, it's to caution ourselves not to think of what they've missed out on to kind of get them into what I think it should be, but the context has changed. They've got new skills, new ideas, new experiences that others have never gone through before. And my challenge, so if I was to take, my position as a leader, how am I challenged to respond differently?
I think that's a really important point, is that I think so many people are still fixed in that idea of returning back to something that won't exist. And I think that seeing it as a progression and a changing thing. Billy, you were a school principal for a number of years. What types of things would you be thinking about right now in terms of managing for next year?
Well, most definitely I'd pick up the points that everyone's made. And in fact, it's been, I think from what we've heard today, it'd be really great if more schools had access to this knowledge about what's been going on behind the scenes, if you like, with the pre-service teachers, because just being on here for 45 minutes today, it has completely changed my outlook in terms of what I would be now expecting, from current staff and new graduate teachers, because I do actually believe what everyone said, that there's a potential excitement about having new people in your school who have who've started their career sort of a challenging and somewhat disrupted time, but that brings with a lot of pluses. Schools, we've heard, have coped really well with the changes, but there has been this sense that, when it all gets back to normal. But I think we're starting to realise that old normal is not coming back. And so as a leader at the school, I would probably be as we quite often do with graduates, embrace what they bring to schools. One of the reasons that you get graduates into your school is because you actually want that, I guess, that vitality that they bring, and that slightly different way that they look at teaching, because things do move on. They have different ways that they relate to the kids. They certainly have different ways, and have had for a long time, in the way that they use technology. And it's always been a bonus for schools. And today, listening to what our people have said, I think, I think we would probably, I'd be looking at graduates now, seeing them as, not so much as leaders, but certainly, excuse the dogs, certainly I would be looking and thinking, well, they have got the skills now that we're going to all need going forward, right? Rather than we've all got the skills and we're going to have to teach them stuff, they're actually going to come into the schools with a lot of the advantages that we're trying to put into our staff as it is. So, yeah, I've changed my opinion entirely. I think it's an exciting time for schools. And as a leader, I'd be looking to tap into that excitement that those young teachers can bring and have always brought to schools.
Absolutely. I'm going to mute your dog, Billy. And Janine, while you're here, we've just got a couple of minutes left. And if anybody does have a question, do put it in the Q&A before we finish. But Janine, can you talk a little bit about the difference between, or maybe some of the advantages of you being in Ballarat in regional Victoria, as opposed to, the big smoke?
Well, we've found that we have a lot of students who come from regional areas, and we have a lot of students who go back and teach in regional areas. More than half of our students would be in both of those categories. And I guess because the regions have been less affected, we've found that the regions have been still very keen to take our students. We've got good relationships with them, and so the impact on our students has been minimal from that point. It's been the metro placements that have been more severely affected. Look, we've had some students apply for a reduction in the amount of days they need to graduate, but we found that to be far, far fewer than we expected, because when we pointed out, some of them tried it on fairly early, but when we pointed out that they still needed to complete all their other assessment tasks, most of them found a way to continue and do most of their days. So we were able to sort of maintain those good relationships with the schools and to talk to the schools about what was best and how they could accommodate our students. And we've come out of it fairly well, and so have our students in that respect. So I think that those good relationships that we've built up have been fantastic. So I think we're going to have a great cohort of regional teachers this year in particular, because they've been less disrupted and they've had great opportunities.
Yeah, I think that's a really good message for metropolitan schools as well, is to, broaden the horizons, look at regional teachers as bringing those skills, but also we need teachers in regional areas as well, so don't take them all. They
might not come to the city though, because they love the regions.
No, that's true, yeah. I might move to the regions actually, but look, sure, Joanna.
I think the other, Janine's point is absolutely right. I think the regional schools and the placements were almost unharmed in a way. But what we found at La Trobe, because we're across regional campuses, we had an initiative where our Melbourne students would go to regional placements, but that couldn't happen. So that kind of innovation had to stop, and we had to sort of reposition what those placements were. But I think there's a lot of learning from regional initiatives that have come out of this that will inform next directions.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've just got a couple of minutes left. If any of you have any advice or things to round up on to finish the webinar, Fiona or Linda, in terms of encouragement for either pre-service teachers or schools out there, have you got any messages that you'd like to let them know?
Fiona, did you want to start off?
Well, I just think it's that idea of, I think what's really come to the fore in this is partnership, and that everybody is going in the same direction. So regardless of our roles in all of this, so whether you're a school leader, an early childhood service leader, the regulator, an ITE provider, a supporter of quality education, whatever it might be, we're all part of the teaching profession. We all pride ourselves on professional practice and learning and lifelong learning. And if anything, this has certainly been a learning experience for everybody, regardless of what that might be. And because of those partnerships that have been formed, I think the only silver lining that potentially has been the result of this pandemic is the assurance that everybody is in conversation. Everybody is being open and clear. And we all do want a quality graduating cohort this year and the next, regardless of whatever circumstance we find ourselves in this bizarre time. So one thing that we will all be doing is working to train mentors to support these pre-service teachers into graduating into schools and early childhood services, and that partnership of communities of practice for these teachers, both back to their providers and then out into the profession. Learning from experienced colleagues, teaching experienced colleagues, like all of the normal things that you would expect in a really lively education environment about good teaching and learning practice. It's all of those things that I think can be really highlighted. And that actually gives people some hope, because most teachers, if not all teachers, want to feel that passion and drive and love teaching. So this is part of that. And I think those communities of practice will actually come to the fore for this graduating cohort. They'll jump in them, boots and all, because they'll just be really wanting to contribute and to then learn and sort of soak up things like a sponge. VIT will continue to offer everything on its program, seminars, webinars, whatever we need to do to support those mentors and the pre-service teachers and the provisionally registered teachers. So reach out for those supports, know that they're there, find that information, yeah, I just wish everybody all the best and to stay safe in a Victorian context.
Can I just jump in there and just perhaps to finish off? As I said, I've been really reassured and really pleased with what we've heard this morning. Fiona had mentioned the word partnerships, and I was just wondering, if all of our guests could respond. Do you think one of the bonuses of this time that we've gone through is that the partnerships between your different parts of what you're doing in education has actually strengthened because of the pandemic? Is that a fair way to summarise what's happened in the last 6 months, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. So Joanna might want to speak to this more broadly, but part of the partnerships that have evolved has included not only all levels of Victorian policy and government, as well as all sectors, including early childhood regulation, so ASEQA, who are our counterpart that in the early childhood space are also part of it, but also federal departments. So I'll hand over to Joanna, because the fact that this particular task force has attracted federal interest because it's so unique.
Yeah. The answer is yes, Billy, because I think what we initially really wanted this to be was obviously a Victorian issue that needed to be solved and worked with, but with a national agenda, because it has cross-jurisdictional interest and priorities. So the task force actually also involves the Commonwealth Department, as well as the Australian Council of Deans and AITSL as well. And the strength of it, if you asked me 12 months ago, what's a partnership like in Victoria across sectors, I would say probably not as good as it should be. And now we're in a position where, as Fiona said, we're all in this together, not in a cliche, but in a real sense, in terms of, we're all responsible for the teaching workforce. And if I was to say anything to leaders in schools is pre-service teachers are really important for your pipeline. Workforce planning and teacher shortage and demand is all about pipeline building, and the work and the priorities around engaging with IT providers and pre-service teachers is priority work for everybody, because otherwise the workforce isn't a professional one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I can add to that. Just within the employment sectors across Victoria, we're seeing exactly the same thing in terms of the partnerships have become absolutely critical. We had good relationships already, and we're planning on doing a lot of work across all sectors, which we had to be as adaptable as our teaching colleagues, and put things online and work out different ways of doing things. And I think that process has brought all of the sectors together. There's been a lot more information sharing, I think, much more far greater ideas sharing, and there's that recognition that we're all working together, not to do the regulatory tick and flick. It's about supporting particularly early career teachers and supporting the better outcomes in all of our schools and early childhood centres. So there's certainly been a lot more stronger partnerships, I'd say, that's come out of this situation within the employment sectors across Victoria.
That's great.
Yeah, I think thank you, everybody. It's just been really informative, and I've got to thank you all personally for your level of optimism and upbeat kind of flavor of this webinar, because I think probably Billy and I have had conversations in the past few weeks where we're kind of seeing a fairly bleak outlook, but you've completely turned that around in terms of, I think possibly, I'll speak for myself, I often see institutions as fairly monolithic and inflexible things, but clearly we've got the VIT and our universities who are behaving in an incredibly adaptive and flexible way, dealing with these issues. If anybody has, any questions or any follow-up, please do get in touch with us at Tradewind, or contact the VIT directly. I'm sure we'd love to have you back on at some point. You were all fantastic. So thank you so much for joining us today. And thanks for everybody who attended. Apologies if we didn't get around to all your questions. But thanks, everybody. That was excellent.